Lily sighed and said, I'm sorry. He can be a bit overprotective at times. Well, he needs to learn to cool it, otherwise he's out of here, Bud said. Bud, come on, that's not fair. He's just trying to protect me, Lily said. Well, that's fine, but he can't beat up my brother, Bud said. I won't tolerate that. Lily shook her head and said, I'll try to talk to him. Good, well, let's go back to enjoying dinner, Bud said. Damn straight, Kenny said. The group walked back over and received a worried glance from Katja. Don't worry, hon, we resolved it, Kenny said to his wife. Lee crouched down and placed a bib on Clementine. You okay? Clementine asked. Yeah, I'm fine, honey, Lee said. You got boo-boos? Clementine said. Yeah, but don't worry, I'm fine. Let's get some food in you, Lee said. He got up and gave the toddler's food from Bud. Thanks, he said, as he accepted the bowl. He stirred the soup around with a plastic spoon before brought a spoonful up. He blew on it to cool it down before offering it to the toddler. I feed myself, Clementine said. Normally I would let you, but this soup's too hot, and we don't have a high chair for you just yet, Lee said. Can you let me feed it to you? Clementine nodded with her head with a smile. Lee had a feeling that the toddler enjoyed being babied. It did make sense since she still had a couple of bottles in the house. She didn't mind being cradled in someone's arms. In fact, she seemed to enjoy it. Lee continued to blow on the top of the soup and offered it to the toddler to eat for a few more minutes. Everyone else was eating soup, but Lee didn't mind. He enjoyed taking care of Clementine. He had wanted this for so long. He was brought up with the mentality that family was important. But now he had a beautiful baby girl to look after. I done, Clementine said with a smile. Your tummy's full? Lee asked. Clementine nodded in response. Come on, Clementine. Lee, you should eat, Katja said. She walked over to the toddler. We'll do more coloring before it's bedtime. Okay, Clementine said with a smile. Lee picked up the small girl and helped her to the ground. He knew that she would struggle to get out of the chair. After all, she was a small 2-year-old. She scampered off of Katja, while Lee grabbed a bowl of soup. He kept himself as he ate. He noticed that the group members were claiming the rooms as their own for the night. Lee would have to make sure that he got a room for himself and Clementine. He finished his soup and then got up to find a room. Hey, Lee, Bud asked. Lee walked over to him to see him approaching. What are you doing? I noticed that everyone was claiming rooms. I want to make sure that I got a room for Clementine and myself, Lee said. That won't be necessary. I already got a room for you and Clem. You'll be sleeping in the room next to me, Bud said. You'll be in room 24. Oh, okay. Thanks, Bud, Lee said. No problem, Bud said. We'll have Carly take over for the night doing and watch. Sounds good. I'll get back over there with Clementine, Lee said. Good idea, Bud said. I think tomorrow we need to get some supplies for her. You know, a high chair, car seat, and some other baby supplies. Oh yeah, that'd be a good idea. I'll see if Katja can keep an eye on her tomorrow, Lee said. Okay, get back to me on that idea, Bud said. Lee nodded before he went over to Katja. Clementine was back to coloring with Duck. However, the fun would soon be interrupted. The sun was starting to sink lower into the sky. It was almost nighttime. Lee grabbed a backpack and had all of Clementine's supplies first. Then he went up to Katja and said, Hey, I'm gonna go on a run with Bud tomorrow. We're gonna get some baby supplies for Clem. Can you watch her? I think she'd be more comfortable if you watched her than if anyone else watched her. Yeah, I wouldn't mind. Besides, I miss this age, Katja said. It was certainly has set in a lot of challenges, but it's still nice. Thanks, Lee said. He looked over to the toddler in his care, and he walked over to her, and he sat down next to her and said, That's a pretty drawing, Lee said. Thanks, Clementine said. She sat upright and smiled at her guardian. Lee returned the smile and said, I'm going on a run with Bud tomorrow. Can you be a big girl and stay with Katja while I'm doing that? Clementine frowned and shook her head. No, you stay, Clementine said. I can't, baby. I have to get some supplies for you, Lee said in a comforting tone of voice. But monsters, Clementine said. We'll be fine. Those monsters won't get either of us, Lee said. No, Clementine said. She didn't want him to leave, but Lee could understand since she was still a baby. But he needed to go out there and help the group in some way, even if she didn't like it. We'll be back. Who knows? Maybe we'll find some candy while we're out there, Lee said. Clementine perked up. Candy? Clementine said with a smile. Yep, Lee said. I could pick you up some candy tomorrow if you let me go on the run. Clementine pondered to herself until she finally said, Okay. Yeah, I'll get some candy for me too, Duck said. Lee then chuckled and said, All right. Well, the sun's almost down, Lee said. I think it's time to go to bed. Yeah, we have a big day tomorrow, Katja said. Come on, Ducky. Okay, Duck muttered. It was obvious that the boy didn't want to go to bed. Lee got up and helped Clementine to her feet. Lee then looked over and saw the number 24 on the door. Bud did mention that he and Clementine were in that room, and Lee crouched down and said, Do you know what the numbers 2 and 4 look like? Lee asked. Clementine nodded her head. Good that you see them that has them together. I'll race you to that door. Clementine smirked and said, That! She pointed to the door that Lee was talking about. Lee smiled and he nodded his head. Okay, Clementine said. Okay, on your mark, get set, go, Lee said. He saw the toddler run fast as she could running towards the door. Lee stood up and went over to catch her. Clementine laughed and squealed as she got closer to the door. Lee was going to let her win, but he was going to make it so close that she would feel happier about her win. She then reached the door and said, I win. Yeah, good job, Clem. You're pretty fast, Lee said. Clementine smiled and said, Thanks. It was followed by a yawn. You ready to go to bed? Mm-hmm, Clementine said with a nod. Lee opened the door, and then he walked inside the room. He flipped on the light switch, but nothing happened. Well, that's going to make it difficult, Lee said. He looked around until he noticed a flashlight on the nightstand. Lee walked over to the flashlight and turned it on. Okay, that will work, Lee said. He took off the backpack and started to rummage through it. He did get some pajamas for Clementine while he was at her home. He was too busy last night to put her in her pajamas, but he eventually pulled on a nightgown, to which it would act as summer pajamas. He placed it on the bed, and he also grabbed the bottle that had water in it, like a pacifier, her unicorn plush toy, a diaper, some wipes, and over the changing mat. Lee then got to the supplies and said, Well, that's all we need, Lee said. He zipped up the backpack and placed it nearby. He then gestured to Clementine to come over. The toddler had a tired look on her face as she walked over. Lee unfolded the changing mat and placed her on top of it. He took off her socks, shoes, and clothing, then changed after her. Afterwards, he put her pajamas on. You tired, aren't you? Lee said. He wasn't too surprised. She did have her little nap too early today. He did pick her up and cradle her in his arms. He placed the unicorn plush toy in his arms before he grabbed the bottle. Lee would have been sit on the bed rather than rocking her in the chair to get her to sleep. The bottle should do its job, helping her get to sleep. Clementine drank from the bottle as she did her best to fight off the sleep, but it didn't take her long for her to drift off to sleep. Lee smiled as he started to take the bottle out. He sat next to the ground and placed a pacifier in her mouth. She was out like a light. It didn't take long for Lee to join her. He was just as tired. He loved looking at her, but it was exhausting at times. Lee started to open his eyes. The room was brighter than what it was when he went to sleep. It was morning, and the first thing he noticed was a foul smell. He sat upright and looked over at Clementine, who was still laying on the bed. Her eyes were open, but just like this morning, she wasn't fully awake. The pacifier was still in her mouth, and she sent a small smile to Lee to greet him in the morning. Morning, Clem, Lee said. He walked around the bed and noticed the toddler had slept all last night, and he asked, Did you poop? The toddler nodded and her head in response. She said something underneath her pacifier to which Lee couldn't understand. Lee took the pacifier out and she said, Change. Okay, let's take care of that, Lee said. He placed the pacifier back in her mouth and he grabbed the changing mat from her bag, along with a diaper and some wipes. He placed the toddler on top of the changing mat and started to change her. Did you sleep well? Lee asked. The toddler nodded her head in response. That's good, Lee said. He finished changing her and pulled out a dress for her to wear for the day. Clementine smiled underneath the pacifier and said something. Once again, the pacifier muffled anything she said. Lee smiled and he took the pacifier out. It's pretty, Clementine cheered. You like dresses? Lee asked. Clementine nodded and her head. I guess you are a girly girl, Lee said with a chuckle. This time he put the pacifier away for later use. Yep, Clementine said. Okay, arms up, Lee said. Clementine put her arms up high, and Lee slipped her into her dress. As soon as she finished putting the sundress on her, he tickled her. Clementine giggled and laughed. Lee continued to tickle. She then laid on the bed and rolled around, trying to get away from being tickled. Lee smiled and picked her up. You awake? Lee asked. Clementine then nodded her head in response, and Lee grabbed the toddler's supplies, went outside to join the group. It still seemed like they were eating eggs and bacon. The aroma made it apparent. He walked over and repeated the same process every day without Larry beating him up. He could still feel the older man's glare being aimed at him. Lee allowed Clementine to feed herself this time, since the food wasn't as scalding hot like yesterday, and she was less likely to cause a mess. For her part, Clementine did an amazing job of keeping herself clean. She must have learned to do this while she was up in the treehouse. Lee ate his breakfast while also making sure Clementine was doing all right. So what's on the to-do list? Kenny asked. Well, it would be a good idea if we start to make a wall around this place. I'll make the motor inn more secure, Vince said. We'll also need supplies like medicine, food, water, weapons, and tools, Justin said. Vince nodded and said, All right, how about you and I go to the hardware store to get some tools? Justin nodded in response. Carly and I can get food, water, and medicine from the pharmacy, Kenny said. Sounds good. Lee and I will go to Macon and pick up some baby supplies for Clementine. We'll fill up your truck and bring it back here while we're at it, Bud said. Lily, you can be in charge until I come back. She should be in charge all the time, not you, Larry hissed. Uh-oh, no. When she was leading, Doug, Glenn, and Carly didn't get a say on what happened. It was pretty much your show, Bud said with a frown. Well, at least she kept them alive and together. That's more than what you did, Larry snapped. How about we vote, Lee said. Anyone want Bud as leader will raise their hands. Anyone who wants Lily as their leader will keep their hands down. I can agree with that, Vince said. Yeah, sounds good to me, Kenny said. All right, just vote then, Justin said. Lee, Clementine, Kenny, Doc, Katja, Bud, Vince, Justin, Carly raised their hands. Lily and Larry were the only ones who didn't raise their hands. I think it's clear that Bud should stay as leader, and Lily could take over when he's absent, Lee said. He lowered his hand. Everyone else followed suit. Who do you think you are, calling the shots like that? Larry inquired. Decision's been made, Larry. You don't like it? You can always leave, Lee said. Fuck you, Larry hissed. He grumbled to himself as he got up, threw away his empty plate, and stomped away from the group. Was that a bad word? Clementine asked. Yeah, don't say that word. It's a very mean and bad word, Lee said. I won't, Clementine said. I should go talk to him, Lily said. She then got up and walked over to her dad. Shame on him, Katja said with an angry expression on her face. He should have never swear in front of the baby. I know, hon, Kenny said. That guy is going to be a problem, Vince said. Look, I don't like him either, but I can't just throw him out unless he does something more drastic, Bud said. He certainly isn't a team player, Justin said. I'll have to keep an eye on him, Bud said. As he finished up his breakfast, Lee walked back over to Clementine as he finished his breakfast. She was a bit messy, but it was all right. Scrambled eggs weren't that hard to clean up. All right, Lee, I'm ready whenever you are, Bud said. Lee nodded his head and then he said, let's do it. He got up from his chair and walked over to Clementine. He crouched down to her eye level and said, Hey, baby, I'm going to get ready to head out. He noticed that she had eaten the eggs on her plate. He didn't even think she would like bacon. She was too young to enjoy it. You be back? Clementine asked with a frown. Of course, be good for Katja, Lee said. Clementine nodded as she leaned in to hug Lee, her tiny arms wrapped around his neck. Lee smiled. He picked up the little girl then and returned the hug. I love you, Clementine said. Lee's smile grew. I love you too. He walked over to Katja and patted the girl on her back. Okay, honey, I gotta go, Lee said. Okay, Clementine said. She released her grip and Lee had handed the baby to Katja. Katja smiled to Lee before she looked to Clementine. So, Clem, how about you show me how you color? Okay, Clementine said with a smile. She climbed down from Katja's lap and ran over to where her crayons and coloring books were. Lee smiled as he watched her scampered off. She was a wonderful little girl, but he could tell that the world was starting to affect her. She seemed to be a little too patient for her age. He then looked over to Bud and smiled and said, "All right, I'm ready to go." "All right, let's head out," Bud said. "Here, you'll need this," Bud said as he handed Lee a fireman's axe. "All right, thanks," Lee said. Bud had nodded, and he led the way out of the motor inn. He and Lee had to jump over a car to get out of the motor inn. They looked down the road towards Macon. Both of them were reluctant to return their hometown, but they needed supplies for Clementine, so they walked down the road.